And I do very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to Christians and Jews United for Israel. You know, it's a misconception in much of the rest of the world that American politics is, when it comes to the Middle East, is dominated by a small minority of people of a particular religion. I saw this very graphically in one of the first things I had to do in the George H.W. Bush administration in 1989. I was sent to Geneva to prevent the Palestine Liberation Organization from becoming a state member of the World Health Organization. The PLO's purpose was very clear, since the charters of UN organizations typically restrict membership to states. If the PLO could get admitted, then that would be a determination by the UN that they were a state, and they expected that that would then affect negotiations with Israel. And so I went, and ultimately we were successful, but very early on in the meeting of the World Health Organization, any number of European diplomats came to me and said, we understand why you're doing this. We understand you've got a political problem in the United States with the Bush administration. And I said, well, what political problem is that exactly? And they said, well, the Jews. The Jews support Israel, and we know that you have to lay this out for them. But we know you're not serious, and so you'll go through the motions, and then the PLO will be admitted. And just so I could be clear to them, I said, well, you know, number one, I'm a Lutheran. Number two, it's the policy of the United States that the PLO is not a state. In fact, that's your policy too. And what we're going to do is win on this issue to demonstrate that the PLO is not going to use the UN system for its own negotiations. And as I say, we were ultimately successful. But that was a very revealing moment about attitudes in Europe and elsewhere in the world. So when you see a group like this one that consists of both Christians and Jews, and when you appreciate the strength of support for Israel across the American community, that is the best evidence that anyone can give that this is an American devotion to our ally, not a religious issue. Because there are so many challenges to the legitimacy of the State of Israel. There are existential challenges in the form of the Iranian nuclear weapons program, international terrorism, and I'll address those in a minute. But I wanted to start by talking about the more subtle, less visible efforts to delegitimize Israel. They've been going on for a long time. Charles referred to the Zionism as Racism resolution, which came in 1975. That was one of the earliest efforts to delegitimize Israel. It was based expressly on the same approach that was used against the apartheid regime in South Africa, which was a racist regime, which was illegitimate, and the effort was to equate Israel with the apartheid regime in South Africa. I've been accused of a lot of things in my career, rarely naivete, but I actually thought that when we repealed ZR in 1991, that would end, at least in the UN system, the international efforts to delegitimize Israel. And sadly, that has not been the case. We've seen it recur in other ways again and again. We saw it in the Durban conference back in 2001, where the NGO group actually did pass a resolution again equating Zionism with racism. We see it over and over again in both the Human Rights Commission and its replacement, the Human Rights Council. These are efforts to try to isolate Israel in the world, to try and make it not respectable to support Israel, and to undermine the political tie that's so important to help sustain Israel in a very difficult environment. This issue is particularly acute in Europe, but it's also growing and I think spreading in this country. It's one of the reasons that I was very pleased to work with, to join with former Spanish Prime Minister Jose Maria Aznar, who a couple of years ago formed a group called the Friends of Israel Initiative, with former heads of state and other leaders from around the world, particularly the Third World, to work to make it clear that efforts to delegitimize Israel were tantamount to efforts to delegitimize the West itself. Because as Aznar understood, Israel is part of the West. It may be a little geographically removed, but in the most important philosophical principles, it is part of the West. And that's why these ongoing efforts that we see around the world to call into question Israel's legitimacy are so important, not just for Israel, although obviously that's where the most immediate negative impacts can be felt, but for the West as a whole. And it also, I think, demonstrates in many ways the truth of the saying that many of you are familiar with, that Israel is kind of like a canary in the coal mine. When they come after Israel, it's true that the focus is on some supposed mistake that Israel has made, but the larger question affects all of us, and therefore paying attention when Israel comes under attack, whether it's in the UN or elsewhere, is very important. And we can see this in a variety of different contexts. When the Security Council of the United Nations, for example, meets to condemn some alleged Israeli transgression, you can see that what's going on is really an act of political theater. Security Council meetings, the ones you see pictures of on television, really are about the most boring meetings in the world, diplomatically. They're scripted. It's like going to a very poorly written play. People come out, we cast our votes, we read our speeches, and that's the end of it. Only when Israel is the subject does the Security Council look like the old TV films from the 1950s, with the galleries filled and the press everywhere, and appearing as if it's a real center of attention, because the opponents of Israel know that it is a perfect venue for them to stir up attention for their point of view. And they use Security Council meetings and other venues in the UN precisely because of the publicity value. And let me just give you a couple of examples. You'll recall the Operation Cast Lead that Israel undertook in the Gaza Strip, and the subsequent Goldstone report in 2009 that was heavily critical of Israel's activity. And the principal criticism, the one that's most important, is that Israel used disproportionate force in response to the terrorist attacks that were carried out against Israeli citizens and territory. Same kind of claim was made over and over again. It was made in the 2006 Hezbollah war against Israel, and you see it all the time. Now, this concept of disproportionate force is a concept that's lifted out of context from just war theory, where there's an analogous concept, but one far removed from the way it's used at the UN. And it's used to cast, in this case, in Operation Cast Lead, to cast Israel in a bad light, as if they've overreacted, that they've been too assertive in responding to the terrorist attacks. Now, if you think about this for a minute, you'll see that it is fundamentally contrary to any country's legitimate right of self-defense. The idea that you can respond to an attack on your country only with proportionate force doesn't make any sense. Under that argument, when the United States was attacked at Pearl Harbor, we would have been entitled only to destroy an equivalent number of Japanese aircraft carriers and battleships that they had sunk at Pearl Harbor. That simply is contrary to any meaningful right of self-defense, because when you're attacked, you're allowed not only as a matter of morality as well as geopolitics, not just to respond to the immediate incident, but to eliminate the threat against you. That's what responds with, in the way that it typically does to terrorist attacks, and usually only after several have built up over a long period of time, it is doing nothing more than using the legitimate right of self-defense that indeed is actually enshrined in the UN Charter. But the importance of the way Israel responds for the United States is critical. The American way of war is never to respond proportionally. Where we're able, it's always to respond with overwhelming force. And the reason for that is twofold. In the hostilities themselves, it is a way of minimizing American casualties, which I think is one of the Commander-in-Chief's highest moral and political responsibilities. The threat of a crushing response is really intended to achieve the highest objective of all, which is to prevent the terrorist attack or the armed attack in the first place. The objective is peace, and the way to achieve peace is to have an unquestioned deterrent capability. So that in Israel's case, the objective that the Israeli governments, since the foundation of the modern state of Israel, have said is they want secure and defensible borders so they're not engaged in a constant state of hostilities. It's not that either Israel or the United States wants hostilities constantly, it's that we want peace. That's the whole point. And the notion that you're not entitled to respond with appropriate force when the peace is breached is simply going to lead to conditions of instability that result in more terrorist acts and more military action. So here's a perfect case of where Israel acts in legitimate self-defense, and the attacks against Israel are thinly veiled attacks against the United States. I think the way we approach hostilities is exactly right. I don't ever want the United States to be in a fair fight. I don't really want the United States to be in a fight at all. And the way you ensure that is to convince everybody else that it's just not worth it. This is not a modern, elaborate doctrine. This is what the ancient Romans used to say, si vis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. George Washington said it in his first State of the Union message. And it's only today that we seem to think that it's a doctrine that can't be justified by the most compelling reason why we have government at all, which is to protect the people. Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, the first duty of the state is to protect the society against the violence of other societies. And that's what this is really all about. Particularly for Israel, in this very dangerous neighborhood, and in the past several years where the international threats have multiplied in country after country in the Middle East and North Africa. You know, almost 3 years ago now, we saw in Tunisia what some people thought would be the outbreak of a wave of democratic change in the Middle East. The Arab Spring, many people told us, was the answer to Al-Qaeda, the answer to international terrorism, that it reflected a new possibility for the region that would bring conditions of peace and security. Now, sadly, that hasn't worked out. And the prospects going forward are pretty unhappy from the perspective of the peoples of the Arab countries having a chance effectively to have representative government. Now, some people in this country and in Europe find that hard to say. They're afraid of criticizing the developments in the Arab world. But it's a fundamental fact that democracy is not simply holding elections and counting votes. Democracy is a culture. It's a way of life. We've worked on it in this country. We've been plenty imperfect enough. We're still working on it right now. You can't expect it to break out overnight. John Stuart Mill, the great philosopher in the 19th century, in his essay on representative government, put it very well when he said that before there can be a representative government, the people have to be ready to receive it. And there are places in the world where the people are not ready to receive it today. It's no knock on an ethnic group or a religion. Look at Europe in the 20th century. They didn't exactly cover themselves with glory when it came to democracy. Look at Russia today. It's a country which has passed out of authoritarianism into a brief period of democracy, and for all we can tell is passing right back into authoritarianism. A tragedy for the people of Russia, but a lesson to us around the world. And we can see across the Middle East the system of state governments is breaking up. It has broken up in Somalia, which is now a base camp for any number of terrorist groups. Yemen has fallen apart. Libya, the central government barely has control over Tripoli, let alone the rest of the country. We can see the same forces in Mali, Algeria, in the Sudan, across the entire scope of North Africa. The Syrian civil war, I think, is only the most egregious example of what we may well see elsewhere. We see it in Iraq, too. So Israel, faced with this risk of instability in country after country, transforming itself into chaos in the region as a whole, is really now in, I think, the most strategic jeopardy that it's been in since independence. Because in addition to the threat of governments that have made treaties with Israel, like Egypt, falling into the wrong hands, obviously the greatest threat is the existential threat from Iran's nuclear weapons program. And Iran is not just a state with a nuclear research program. Iran, for decades, has been the world's central banker for international terrorism. We have it on our list of state sponsors of terrorism for a reason. Iran is an equal opportunity state sponsor of terrorism. It supports Shia terrorists like Hezbollah, like the terrorists in Iraq who attack American and other coalition forces with munitions and weapons supplied by the Iranian government. Iran finances and arms Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It's armed its former sworn enemies, the Taliban in Afghanistan, and terrorists around the world. So this is a government that has made it clear over the years that it will engage in fundamentally uncivilized practices against its enemies, because that's what terrorism is. The history of the law of war in the West has been systematically, imperfectly, but systematically, to try to remove civilians from combat, to narrowly define what is permissible, to confine it to conflicting militaries. Terrorism rejects centuries of effort to protect innocent civilian populations. The only purpose of terrorism is to inflict harm on civilians. I think that's uncivilized. I think we ought to call it by name, and that's what the government of Iran has specialized in since the revolution of 1979. So when you see a government like that, which engages in terrorism internationally, which represses its own people at home, When you see a government like that developing nuclear weapons, this is something that should be of enormous concern. And Iran has been on this course now for over 20 years. It has a broad and deep nuclear infrastructure. It has lied about that infrastructure the entire period of time. It has tried to deceive the International Atomic Energy Agency. It has hidden its facilities, which if they were purely for peaceful purposes, as it says, it would not only have a reason to hide, it would want to make them visible for the whole world to see, to protect them against attack. Because if there were international inspectors present all the time, verifying that their nuclear activities were peaceful, there would be no excuse, no justification for anyone to attack. But time and time again, Iran has concealed information. It's destroyed buildings, bulldozed, excavated dirt to remove indications of radioactivity. There's simply no explanation for what Iran is doing other than a nuclear weapons program. I'll give you two examples. One of the things that we uncovered some years ago was that Iran had a design program to build hollow hemispheres of uranium or plutonium. And that's the way you make a nuclear weapon. You take two hollow hemispheres of enriched uranium or plutonium, you put them together, you surround it with high explosives, you detonate the explosives, it compresses the fissile material until you get the uncontrolled chain reaction of a nuclear explosion. Peaceful nuclear reactors don't use hollow hemispheres of enriched uranium. Moreover, the Iranians have said, well, you know, we need a peaceful nuclear power program because we're running out of oil and natural gas. So when I was in the government, I asked our Department of Energy, is there any possible truth to this claim? The Energy Department looked at its information and said, well, at current rates of domestic consumption and export, Iran will run out of oil and natural gas in 400 years. So, of course, any sensible person is building nuclear power facilities against that day 400 years from now. Iran has no legitimate use for this program, for this extensive enrichment activity that's engaged in, with a heavy water production facility and a heavy water reactor it's building to efficiently spend fuel as a second route to nuclear weapons alongside of the enriched uranium route. There's simply no question that at this point, the most likely outcome is that Iran will get nuclear weapons. Diplomacy has failed. We've been negotiating with Iran for over 10 years. Hassan Rouhani, the new president of Iran, was once Iran's chief nuclear negotiator 10 years ago. He knew how to play the Europeans like a violin. He's trying to do it again today. We can only hope that he will fail. Economic sanctions have imposed a good deal of pain on the population of Iran, but they have not slowed down the nuclear weapons program at all. The Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency has said as much. The Obama administration's Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, so testified earlier this year. So that absent any further outside involvement, Iran will get nuclear weapons at a time of its choosing. Now, there are some who say that a nuclear Iran can be contained and deterred. I don't think that's true. This is not the same kind of regime that we deterred as we did the Soviets during the Cold War. A very different mentality. I'm sure you all know Bernard Lewis's famous observation that if you're a desire to go to the next world, if you're guaranteed that that's going to happen, that doesn't act as a deterrent, it acts as an incentive. And that's why they support international terrorism. It's a very dangerous regime. But even if I were wrong and a nuclear Iran could be contained and deterred, it won't stop with Iran. Manifestly, Secretary of State Clinton said 2 years ago that, and correctly, that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia will get nuclear weapons, Egypt will get nuclear weapons, Turkey will get nuclear weapons, and perhaps others. So that in an already dangerous and volatile region, you could have half a dozen or more nuclear weapon states in a relatively short period of time. And that's one reason that Iran is not rushing to build nuclear weapons. They don't fear interference. The United States says, well, all options are on the table. Nobody believes that in current circumstances. Nobody believes that. Israel doesn't believe it. Worse, the Iranians don't believe it. So the one possible interference, the one variable that could change the progress of Iran toward nuclear weapons is what decision Israel makes. Twice before in its history, in 1981 and September 2007, Israel has struck nuclear targets in hostile states in the region. I don't know what course Israel will take. It is an incredibly difficult decision for any leader in Israel to make. But I would say this, and I think it's important that we understand this now, in advance of any possible Israeli action, that if Israel decides to go after the Iranian nuclear weapons program preemptively, that will amount to a legitimate exercise of Israel's right of self-defense. Explain that to people in this country, because if the attack occurs, we will not have advance warning. We will wake up here in the United States one morning and find out that it's already underway. It will be a very costly enterprise for Israel in terms of human life and resources. It will be critical for the United States to supply Israel with equipment and ordnance to make up for the losses that Israel will sustain, because it will be critical for Israel to defend itself against a likely Iranian response, unleashing Hezbollah in Lebanon or Hamas in the Gaza Strip. So there can be no hesitation and no delay in Congress and the White House acting quickly to provide Israel with the necessary assistance to continue to act in its own self-defense. In our political debates here in the United States, we're obviously concerned about our economy. I understand that, but you know, our adversaries around the world are not gracious enough to wait for us to get our economic house in order before challenging us. And although I think, unfortunately, I probably presented a pretty depressing picture about the state of the world, there's one thing that never depresses me, and that's the spirit of the American people. And it's a spirit... You obviously can feel a kindred spirit in Israel. It is critical for the United States, for our people, to stand up and say to our political leaders, we believe in defending ourselves, we believe in defending our allies, we believe in doing what's necessary to protect ourselves and our civilization, and we will do what is necessary to defend Israel. Thank you very much.